righty. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our session number 4 of the Ag Management Program Series this year. I'm Jacqueline Jones Doyle with Tarrant County. With us today and presenting today is Mr. Chad Cummings, Ag and Natural Resources Agent from Grayson County. We do ask that everybody does try to keep their microphones muted. That way we just don't have a whole lot of background noise. We also ask that if you have any questions, please refer those questions to the chat box and we will, I will relay it to Chad. This program is also being recorded and will be posted to the Tarrant County AgriLife YouTube page probably next week. That link will be sent out to everyone for a refresher course as well. And at the end of the course, we will also have a quick survey for everyone to fill out. This just helps Chad and I in terms of our jobs and reporting back not only to the county, but to the state for what producers are wanting and needing across the state in terms of education. With that being said, I will turn the presentation and the program over to Chad.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jacqueline. Hello, everybody, and thank you all for joining. My name is Chad Cummings, and like Jacqueline said, I'm the County Extension Agent for Ag and Natural Resources over in Grayson County. Just to give you a brief little bit of background on myself, so I haven't been an agent for long. Started out my career in the ag industry, working for Dow AgroSciences, which then became Corteva. Started with them back in 2007 and worked here in the South Central U.S. as a R&D guy, or a field scientist was the proper term, and then switched over into extension back in 2022 in April, just a little over a year ago now. So prior to that, though, I was actually a Oklahoma State grad student. So forgive me for being originally from north of the border, but have always had a really good relationship with a lot of the folks down here and really enjoy getting to work on multiple projects with some of my counterparts across the state and across the region as well. So my wife and I live on a small ranch over north of Bonham, Texas, and we've been there for about 8 years now. Have our daughters there in Bell School, which is located there in the east side of Grayson County. And so really happy to be doing what I'm doing, and I enjoy the heck out of it. You'll notice that I do have a background in invasive species ecology and rangeland ecology, working primarily with prescribed fire in my graduate degree program. And then the entomology and weed science part of it really helped mold some of the questions that I answered or asked during my PhD dissertation. So I've been doing this for a long time. And in fact, one of my first prescribed fires was probably back in 1996. And so I've been utilizing these tools for quite a long time and very excited to get to share them with you all today. So we're going to talk about a lot of different topics today. I'm going to start off with just some not really elementary because it's at a pretty high level, but we're going to talk a little bit about ecosystem services and ecology and really kind of delve into what holistic management is and how that can relate to rangeland management, pasture management. I know there's probably a split of folks on here, folks that have native range and some that have introduced grasslands. So we'll talk a little bit about both and then really go into what our invasive species are and what constitutes an invasive, what is not, and how even though we have a lot of species in the region that are native, in quotes, a lot of times they can become problems as well. Then we'll go into some weed and woody plant ID for those of you that are kind of new to the systems. Some of them will be new, some of them will be kind of recognizable, but hopefully we get to teach y'all a little bit about something this go around. And then we're going to go into some of the different tools that we can use to manage those. So excited to get deep into this, and hopefully we don't get too deep in the weeds, but we'll see if we can make it happen. Jacqueline pointed out that the questions will need to go into the chat. I will also say that when we look at our weed ID and woody plant ID, I also have some questions for you about identification. If you would simply write in the chat box what you think that plant might be as we get there, we can get started and try to keep going pretty smoothly and not interrupt too much. But if we do have a question, please ask it at the time you have it in the chat box, and we'll try to address that as we go. Oh, I did forget one other deal. We'll talk just a little bit about native grass management and how it responds to prescribed fire. Okay, so getting deep into the ecology part of it, many of you have probably witnessed or at least understand that when we have an event occur, whether that's a fire, planned or a wildfire, whether we have a mowing event or a brush control grubbing event, some sort of large occurrence that happens, many times the secondary succession that occurs after that is in a very systematic way. Many times the annual plants or ruderal plants will come in first. These are typically very small root systems. These are very quick growing plants. Many of our what we would term weedy plants in the pastures are going to be these early successional plants. And as we get further and further away from that disturbance event, the grasses and the perennials start to respond and they start to take over a little bit more dominance. But ultimately, if a landscape is left to go untouched, and we see it day in and day out, those will result in encroachment by trees, whether those are native trees that are endemic there and maybe have seed in the soil, or those that come in and are spread by different carriers, whether that be small mammals or birds. Many animals can transport, and even the wind can transport seeds and cause an invasion to occur. And as that invasion occurs, we see that become the dominant overstory and that climax community that ends up resulting. So in this particular example, it says 150 years it took for that mature oak and hickory forest to occur. We know that here in the South Central US, a lot of times that can happen within 10 to 15 years. And so the scale and the rapidity of that to happen is pretty quick compared to this diagram. But this diagram was also based off of Western coniferous forests. And so you can guess that it's going to take a little bit longer out in the desert west for this to occur. So when we say ecosystem services, I just wanted to make sure that everybody kind of had a background for what those were. Ecosystem services are simply what nature provides us for free. So whether we think about the regulating services, so pollination would be one very good example of that. Photosynthesis would be another one, where those processes are provided by the plant system and by the plant populations. Provisioning services, those are products that we obtain from the system. So that would be like our crops, maybe some of our wood products, and many of our animals. And then cultural services, of course, would be those where we have not really a material benefit, but something that we obtain from the ecosystem, whether that's nature hiking, whether that's hunting and fishing, those types of services that we actually can not necessarily have a pure product from all the time, but we get to enjoy the nature as it is. And then those supporting services, and those are those services that are offered to other ecosystem services as well. And so there's a wide variety of different things that are offered there. One thing to note is that even across the globe, we just have so many different services that we can think about. When we think about land management, what we do on the land can impact each and every one of these in some way. Many times, if we're good stewards of the land, that benefit can be exponentially seen across landscapes. But when we start to abuse the system, when we start to use tools in the wrong way, many times we can have both huge and long-lasting consequences to our actions. And so the more we can think about and strategize to what we want to do, the better off we are. Going into it with a plan can make all the difference. So when we think going back to that woody plant encroachment, that's one of our biggest hindrances and one of our biggest threats to rangeland ecology and rangeland success, prairies and pastures. Woody plants are going to be the climax community no matter what. If a piece of ground is left untouched, it will ultimately become a forest. And that could be 5 to 10 years. That could be 10 to 20 years. That could be 150 years plus, depending on what ecosystem we're talking about. So when we see that occur, what we start with is a woodland with grass underneath. And so we're starting to see that in this particular picture on the right. This actual field was taken, it's right here on Highway 82 in Grayson County, on the east side of Sherman. And we have kind of a riparian area on the right-hand side of that picture. And from that riparian area, you can see that many of the tree species that are represented in that riparian area are starting to reach out to the left and go out into that more or less intact prairie. So that could be birds distributing that. That could be different animals that are going to carry those seeds across that landscape, but that invasion is occurring as we watch it. So I've been watching this pasture every day for the last year and a half or so, and it's just becoming more and more trees because it's a relatively unmanaged pasture. They don't really do anything with it. It's not fenced in, so it's not grazed. They don't really hay it too much. So there's a couple of different things that could be happening there, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Ultimately, that becomes an unproductive, dense forest. And so I've had several landowners that have talked with me. They say that they really love the fact that they have this thicket area because the wildlife love to use it. Well, that's somewhat true for some wildlife species, but in the grander scheme of things, having a lot of plant diversity out there is what's necessary to support the most abundant resources that we have, the biodiversity that we have. So a lot of the producers in my county say, well, that's not going to happen here. I mean, we manage our grass and our pastures. Well, we do, and some of us do. But we actually see through a program that I've worked with a lot here with the Prairie Project called the Rangeland Analysis Platform. And this is free software that anybody can access. I encourage you to go on and look at it. Just type in Rangeland Analysis Platform in your Google engine or in whatever online engine that you utilize, and it will come up. And it's a really nice, handy little program that you can utilize. This graph is actually showing the decline in grass cover over the course of about 35 to 40 years in Grayson County as a whole. And subsequently, we have a sharp increase in tree cover. And so we're getting actually up close to 30% tree cover across the entire county. This is excluding the urbanized areas. So this is just truly looking at cropland, pasture land, and wildland. Many of you may know that up around Lake Texoma, we have a pretty big wildlife management area there. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service operates a refuge there. And so that is some of that area that's indicated here, but many of these are just privately owned pastures across the county. We see that increase. Well, you're saying, okay, that can happen in Grayson County, but maybe not in Tarrant County. You know, I actually looked at that, and I did not even have to redo those line graphs, y'all. This is the exact same line graph put over your data. So it skews a little bit because that decline in grass actually occurs at a much faster rate in Tarrant County over the last 15 years or so than it did in Grayson County. But the average increase in trees is actually occurring right at the same rate. And so we see that occurring over about 35, 40 years. But I can tell you that prior to the database that this is generated from, I guarantee you that we've been seeing that since the 1800s in all actuality, when European settlement occurred and we started moving livestock across the country. The livestock would carry seeds, mesquite and juniper seeds in particular. We would see areas that didn't get utilized, and we would see a lot of woody plant encroachment over time. So there's a couple of things recently that have really started to impact that. Absentee land ownership is one big one. And so what happens there is the landowner may own property. They may only see it once or twice a month, maybe even less than that, maybe just during hunting season. And so as those tree species and as those other species that are invasive start to come into the area, they go unnoticed until there's a predicament of just really heavily overgrown woodland that occurs in the area. Urbanization is one big one, and it's occurring both in Grayson County and I know in the DFW area for sure. As we see parts of the acreage become urbanized, we start to see a rise in the number of non-native species that are represented there as well. Lack of management is one of our big ones. And then selling off ag land to development is probably the biggest factor in Grayson County and much of North Texas that we see on a regular basis. And so when we see that occur, you have an acreage that goes from being hundreds or maybe up to 1,000 acres sold into parcels. That can sometimes be broken down into a urbanized development where you have half acre or 1 acre lots. And so you have a lot of breakup of the ecosystem. You have a lot of opportunity for invasive species and trees to come into those areas that may or may not be native. And so we start to see an impact there for sure. So just demographically speaking and population speaking, we have a huge increase in several different areas of the state of Texas itself. Raul Lopez actually presented this to us last summer at a meeting, and I asked him if I could borrow the slides, and he said, sure, of course. But really, in the nation, we have 7 of the 15 most rapidly growing cities in the nation located right here in Texas. Many of you can guess that the DFW Metroplex, the San Antonio to Austin Metroplex, and then the Houston area are some of the big ones. But even outside of that, going up into almost the Oklahoma border, we see a huge influx of population, and there's numbers as high as 26 folks per day that are coming into some of these areas from outside. And so that rapid rate of growth can have a huge economic and ecological impact on the area. And we see that happening on a regular basis. So Woody Plants as a whole, and going back to this prairie project that I've worked with, this is a multi-state project that is collaboration between the University of Nebraska, Oklahoma State University, and Texas A&M University. Many of us came from the same program there in Oklahoma State with Sam Fullendorf and Dave Engel. Those were 2 of my advisors. And then I have counterparts at UNL and Texas A&M both, as well as some counterparts in Kansas, that we are now working on a project to raise awareness of prairies and grasslands, try to help folks understand the importance of trying to prevent the loss of these ecosystems. And so what they've generated with the help from the USDA and the University of Oregon to develop this free online resource where they can actually track tree cover over time using both on-the-ground data and also data generated from near-infrared photography and from satellite images. We can actually see that occur. And so you're saying back in 1984, we probably didn't have that data from the satellites necessarily, and that's probably true, but we had some data from satellites, and we probably had some pretty coarse data, but over time that data gets finer and finer, and we're able to ground truth that and recognize that we are having a major outbreak and invasion of woody plant cover across the region in the Great Plains. What we see happening in many of these areas is we go up to 75% cover or more, and that just becomes a very dense forest that is really unusable for many uses. So pasture and range condition, that's something that Jacqueline and I and our counterparts across the state actually plug in every month or every week, and the USDA actually uses that data. So Jacqueline, this is our data at work. I hope you feel like you're getting some use out of it now. But every week we turn in information about what our conditions are out there in the world. And so range and pasture condition represented here by month. And you see that we have years from 2018 up to 2022. Many of you probably recognize that over the course of that time, there were wet years and dry years, but this is specifically looking at the percentage of the land that's in good and excellent condition. And so represented by good grass cover, represented by good growth. And whether that's stocking rate differences or moisture differences, a combination of the two likely, we really see that there's a lot of fluctuation and variability. But the one thing that I wanted to point out is that when we start to take this data and look at it at the beginning of the warm season growing season, starting off in about May 1st, you'll notice that from 2018 down to 2022, we have successfully lowered the condition of our beginning values over time. And that's not good. So the fact that we have close to zero, if not 10% or so in good to excellent condition at the start of this past calendar year. Folks, we went into drought early, and we still are in drought in many parts of the state a year and a half later. And so we really see that occurring across the U.S., but also in the state of Texas. And so this is the data from Texas ourselves, really noting that we have close to 0% at the end of August is when I pulled this data set the last time. But I can tell you that it's not gotten any better. We really are very low in good to excellent percentage of pasture and rangeland in Texas. And so what that means is we don't have the grass, we don't have the forage out there for livestock to graze. We don't have the forage out there for our wildlife to utilize. We're in rough shape. And some of that is due to the lack of moisture. We might also see that we had lots of cattle liquidated this last calendar year because we ran out of forage and we ran out of hay. It's just a problem that we're going to see year over year, and we see that decline on a regular basis. So what does that look like on the pasture scale? And many of you may recognize some of these pastures. It's kind of a pictorial diagram, obviously. So the pastures over on the far left are kind of pristine, if you want to call it that, for grazing cattle. Not a whole lot of weed or woody plant development there at all. And as we move across the pastures there, we start to see more weeds. We start to see more brush represented there. And as we move from left to right, we also see less and less head of cattle. So we see that continuum. We know that by and large, we actually get more biodiversity as we go from left to right to a point. And I say to a point because biodiversity is most when we have a little bit of everything represented, right? So if we have a predominance of, say, KR bluestem or beadall bluestem or Bermuda grass, we're going to have a near monoculture. The biodiversity is going to be relatively low because not only do we have a low representation of plants, but we don't have a representation of much of any of the other higher trophic levels either. We have fewer insects that are out there. We have fewer small mammals, fewer birds. And so that true biodiversity representation is very low at that left-hand side. Now, if you're just a cattle rancher and you are just going for cattle production, the left-hand side might be where you want to be. Or if you are a hay producer that's looking for horse quality hay, the left-hand side is where you want to be on your particular pastures. But when we get into native rangelands and when we get into prairies that are still intact, that are not introduced grasslands, we want to make sure that we maintain some biodiversity out there because it's for the greater good of the system, the cattle production, and the wildlife themselves. Once we get into that dense understory and dense overstory of brush, we really start to lose quite a bit of our biodiversity because then we only select for all of the birds and the wildlife and the insects that like to have that tree cover. And so we actually go back down in biodiversity when we get into those very dense overstories and understories. Even though some of the wildlife may appreciate that thicket look, not all of the wildlife does for sure. And when we don't have any diversity of ecosystem out there, it becomes very difficult to raise a number of different individuals versus one species. So where are all your pastures on this? I mean, obviously, some of them may be on the left-hand side that are well-managed Bermuda grass pastures or KR bluestem pastures. Some of them may be far on the right where we have senderos through the woodland for the wildlife to move, but by and large, they're pretty dense thickets. Where are they? Kind of think about that for a second. And do all of them have to be at the same place? Do all of your pastures have to be either on the left or on the right? I would venture to bet that they don't. You can have some pastures that you keep for good hay meadows. You can have some pastures that you have that are a little bit overgrown or may have some woody plant encroachment into them. Those are actually going to benefit some certain different wildlife species than the ones that are pristine grassland. So it's a little bit of both in my mind of where we should be. So when we think about holistic management, and that's kind of a catchphrase word, I will say, and it is a movement. It is a group of folks globally that are trying a new system, and it has been around for a little while. The Allen Savory Institute has been around for decades now. And really, holistic management is just for us to think about the ecosystems in a way where we are not necessarily controlling any certain part of it, but we're more managing that complexity. We're managing that dynamic of the changing ecosystem, kind of similar to what I talked about earlier, where we have that declining range condition. If you back in 1995 decided that you were going to utilize your property in one certain way and you kept it that way throughout that entire 40 years, there's a good chance that your objectives, your stocking rate, everything that you thought about in 1995 is not going to be applicable right here in 2023. We had to have changed that over time to be able to get there. And so it's very important for us to understand that by and large, we have to concentrate on being adaptive and being able to look at the new metrics that are there. We have to assess our stocking rate and change that given the new metrics. We have to assess whether we're going to stay in livestock or go to wildlife, whether we're going to manage both and how we're going to do that. So it's important for us to really understand all of those different aspects, that holistic view of it, to be able to make the right decision. And not to have that be a static decision, but have that be one where we reassess that annually to figure out if we need to modify that end goal or that end plan. So there's a diagram of this, and it just kind of encompasses everything that I was talking about. You know, we have the planned grazing, we have the land planning. So which pastures are we going to leave pristine grassland? Which ones are we going to let get a little bit of overgrown? What are we going to utilize as our budget, and how do we utilize that budget to meet our goals? And then actually going back out and assessing whether that's working for each individual pasture unit or each individual spot in our land. Is that meeting those ecological expectations, or do we need to change that slightly? And the ability for us to adapt and the ability for us to utilize different tools is going to be the key there. And making sure that what we look at in the context of everything that's in that ecosystem is going to be the key to success. So I'm going to switch gears here real quick, but before I do, Jacqueline, I was just going to see if there are any questions real quick.
It would help if I'd unmute before I answered, but there are
That's
no questions
probably
at this time.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and keep cruising, and I just realized that I was looking at the wrong screen for my camera to be showing my face. So I apologize for looking off to the side the whole time, but I've switched back to this screen now that it'll make more sense. So if we think about definitions of what an invasive is, now we're getting into the nuts and bolts of what I did a lot of my graduate work on. An exotic plant itself is one that's from outside the region, outside the US, and is non-native to its current location. Now, there are a little bit of nuances to that definition, and we'll get into those in just a second. But for a plant to be invasive, it has to be non-native or alien to the ecosystem under consideration, and it has to cause an economic or environmental harm to the ecosystem in which it becomes prevalent in. Now, the reason I say there's some nuances is that depending on who's defining this, you might say that any native plant cannot be invasive. And that would be somewhat true depending on what your definition is. And for that kind of school of thought, we have another term for many of those native plants that still become problems, and we call those encroaching brush. We call those encroaching species in general. But one of the other considerations or other camps of thought is that if a species is native to Texas or a species is native to the US, but it actually starts to invade an ecosystem that it is not normally found in, it too can be considered invasive. And so if we think about something like a juniper tree or a eastern red cedar tree, those trees were predominantly found in very rocky outcrops or down in very low areas of the ecosystems where it originated in the US here. And anywhere where fire could get to, that would be burned out because the eastern red cedar is very sensitive. Many of our junipers are sensitive to fire. They will be burned up. So if we think about it from a broad sense, or maybe in that other camp, if an eastern red cedar gets out into the, or a juniper of any kind gets out into the uplands and is established there and becomes naturalized, then that too could be considered invasive. So I bring that up only to say that for USDA consideration, many of our native species cannot be considered invasive. And so to be able to get programs for some of those, many of our native species may or may not classify for some of those programs for management, but many of them will. So why are they so impactful? There's a couple of different reasons. I'm going to go ahead and load this slide up so we can just read through them. Lack of natural population control is one big one in the new territory. Many of our species that come from outside the US or outside the region would normally have either fungal pathogens that keep them at bay, or maybe insects or worms that may keep them at bay. And when they move to that new territory, they no longer have those controls. They also can typically exploit a lot of resources that those native organisms cannot. Many of them are drought tolerant or different nutrient value tolerant, where even if a nitrogen or phosphorus is really low, many of our native plants don't do as well there, but this new plant may be able to succeed there where it cannot. They also typically have a wide range of conditions where the species thrives, and not just exist, but actually thrive. So something like a eastern red cedar or a Sericea lespedeza, which we'll talk about just briefly here in a little bit, but they may be able to survive much greater fluctuations in drought or wet than many of our native species can. Almost always, these invasive species are going to have high reproductive rates, and their reproductive efficiency is going to be very high as well. Also, their germination rate, many of their seeds are going to be viable, versus some of our natives may not have that. We also see that invasive species can modify the natural processes around it. So if you think of something like cheatgrass or Bromus tectorum out in the western US, that's the annual grass that causes so many problems in the montane regions, where it literally changes the fire cycle to where acres burn annually that may have only burned once every 50 to 100 years prior to the introduction of cheatgrass. And so that's one species that has completely changed the entire dynamic. So changes in multiple ecosystem processes and functions, where we start to affect all those upper trophic levels as well. So there's a couple of different reasons why invasives are important. You know, money obviously has to be part of it. $137 billion annually from the US is used to try to control invasives. That's just hard money. That's not the indirect costs that can be associated with the loss of some of those other key beneficial parts of the ecosystem. Biodiversity and productivity decrease dramatically. We see that in many cases. Now, I will say that with something like a KR bluestem or an old world bluestem beedall, where we go into a system and we plant a monoculture of that, that can increase the productivity of that one species and maybe the tonnage per acre. But when we think about biodiversity as a whole, we start to lose that a lot. Biophysical processes can also be changed quite significantly. And if we think about something like juniper trees that can change the infiltration rate around them, many times we see that happen. And then we can also see much of the carbon sequestration change over time as well, depending on how those shifts occur. As rangeland managers, we kind of consider 30% a magic number. So when I said that you can have some and still have a beneficial environment, I'm definitely in that mindset. When we have less than 30% cover, we actually see a lot of benefit and a lot of increase in biodiversity from having a few shrubs. But it's those areas that become very overgrown. The overstory is predominantly woody plants. We see major shifts in a lot of these different metrics, and you can see that on the landscape for sure. So when we think about the plants here in North Texas, we have a lot of them, and there are a lot that can help us, a lot that can be considered weedy, depending on what your end-all objectives are. Many times, some of these that one person considers a nice, pretty wildflower, another person may consider a major weed that they have to get rid of on a regular basis. So some of them that are native here in our part of the world, black-eyed Susan, common broomweed, woolly croton are some of the annual favorites. Obviously, we have lots of sunflowers out west that are perennial favorites as well, and they're usually native. And then we have a lot of trees like honey locust and honey mesquite, eastern red cedar, and just all the junipers in particular. Sweet gum, cedar elm, and winged elm are all pretty much native to Texas. Silver blue stem and broom sedge blue stem are also some that are roadside problems many times, but we see those being native here. When we think about those that are true invasives, a lot of these are going to be problematic more on the eastern half of the geography that Jacqueline and I share, but a lot of them you may know of because you've probably seen them in ornamental plantings in neighborhoods, right? So many of these are common to use in ornamental plantings, but if they escape from those plantings, that's when they become a problem. One of the big ones that I'll talk about a little bit later is Callery pear or Bradford pear. That is kind of one of the most heavily utilized trees in urban development, much to my chagrin, but we'll get into that a little bit later. And then you can think about some of these grasses, depending on what side of the lens of the glass you look at. So something like Bermuda grass could be a savior for many folks, as well as old world blue stem, save us from drought, save us from a lot of lower quality production. And then many folks may find them problematic weed. I know one of my master gardeners that just went through our intern class recently, her demise is Bermuda grass, and that's one of her most hated species. So it just kind of depends on how you look at it. You'll also notice, I want to page up one more time, but you'll also notice that a lot of these came from Asia, and there's a reason behind that. Many of our early botanists wanted to go find the newest and best forage, the newest and best ornamental plant, the newest and best vegetable. And so they would go to Asia in particular, looking for that solution. And because our climates are fairly similar, because our rainfall patterns are fairly similar, many of those species that were endemic to Asia actually persist and do very, very well here. So that's good and bad, depending on whether you're a nursery worker or someone who's out in the rangeland trying to keep all the invasives out. So if we think about all the different control methods that we can use when we start to manage rangelands and pastures, there's quite a few of them. So I'm going to start with some of our mechanical and prescribed fire control methods. Many of you may have seen the machines here, but the one on the left is a flailing mower. That can take down a standing adult tree in about 10 seconds because that drum starts to roll around and those little teeth will just shred bark and limbs and leaves of any tree that it comes in contact with. And so to change the ecosystem and change everything really quickly, that's a good tool to use. It is very costly, obviously, to manage and run that tool. One down at the bottom there on the skid steer is more of a tree shear. And those are also very helpful depending on what your management objectives are. They're more a finesse tool and will just cut a tree at the surface. So for any of our non-resprouting trees, those work very well. Then we have fire, obviously, that's utilized across many of our landscapes. I will say that depending on where you're located, fire may or may not be a really good viable tool. So if you're located in a small 5-acre pasture within a housing development or adjacent landowners that may or may not appreciate fire. It becomes more of a finesse game on how you utilize that tool. And smoke management is as much a carrying factor there as the actual fire itself. Many folks that utilize fire work together in prescribed burn associations where they group together resources, and that helps minimize the liability, but also maximize the effort between both monetary effort and also political power. So we can actually utilize many of the folks in our communities to work together to meet an end goal. Another control mechanism is chemical control, and that's one that we rely on fairly regularly, especially in introduced grasslands and pastures. I will say that there are not just one single effort in chemical control methods, and that individual plant treatment that Dr. Lyons is using there as an example with the backpack pump, that can be one of those tools that is utilized in a very small scale, but can make a huge amount of difference. And so we really see that be a benefit across the country and across our state for sure. The tools on the bottom and on the right are a little bit more broadcast type tools, whether it's a pull behind tractor or a UTV sprayer. We can get across a lot of acres doing that. And depending on the ecosystem, we can really get some benefit there. I will say that many of you may have heard of Brush Busters, and that is still a great program. But when we developed that program, many of our herbicides were very broad spectrum, didn't have much finesse to them. So if we used them, we controlled everything on the landscape. Well, the reality is that many of our herbicides actually are fine-tuned to just specific species that they control now. And so we can actually utilize some of those to control certain bad species and leave many of the good species left untouched. So the old herbicide days are gone for the most part. We still do have those tools in many cases, but in a lot of cases, we actually use more selective herbicides to meet our end goals. So if we think about the pros and cons, especially when it comes down to both financial and how they impact the environment of either mechanical and fire controls or chemical controls, we'll kind of talk through those just briefly. So mechanical controls or fire controls, you'll notice I have the $2 signs up to $4 signs, and that is a reality. And the reason there's such a wide gap there is that some of those tools are very, very cost efficient. But if you have to get a big D9 dozer in there and do a whole bunch of grubbing work or push work, that can get very costly on a per acre basis. And so it really depends on the type of equipment that you're using, what that equipment, fuel, labor, and time is going to look like on a cost standpoint. Many times if we're grubbing or chaining or even mowing or shredding, all of those will be equipment, heavy equipment on the site and across the site as a whole. Many times that heavy equipment, whether it's tracked or tired, can definitely make huge impacts, especially in these delicate, dry ecosystems that can last for a very long time. So you may not be wanting to increase the number of invasive species and specifically those annuals and short-lived perennials that can come in. But the reality is when you make a big open spot with that D5 dozer, D9 dozer, that's going to be a lot of open area to potentially have a lot of invasion over time, and that will stay that way, especially when we get further into the west and we have some of that soil crust that once disturbed takes decades to be able to replenish. So that can definitely have a huge impact. One of the other things is that if we just shear it or chop it, a lot of times we're going to have brush piles that result from that. So whether we use fire as the tool or not, we may still have to have fire in the system to be able to drop the entire biomass that's resulting from that potential use. When we think about chemical control measures, $2 signs to $3 signs, I mean, there are some treatments that get up into the hundreds depending on what you're doing and how you're doing it. But the reality is that we actually have a relatively low cost for many of these treatments. And if we think about individual plant treatment or IPT there on the end, versus a ground or aerial broadcast treatment, the amount of impact that we have on those non-target plants, non-target organisms is going to be relatively low. And that will obviously depend on what type of herbicide we use, what type of application technique we use, because some of those are broad spectrum and can have wide reaching impacts, but some of them are very fine tuned. And we'll go into that in just a little bit as well. So we can still have standing dead trees in some of those areas or brush piles that we need to utilize. And just as a side note, I will say in almost every case, I would never, ever recommend relying solely on a herbicide application for management. It's always better to utilize that as a part of a broader integrated management approach that utilizes grazing, utilizes wildlife management, utilizes some of our other mechanical types of control or fire, and really make sure that we think about all the tools that are out there when we start to manage the land. So let's go into some of these specifics. Now, can anybody, and I realize that this one may not be as common out in Jacqueline's territory as it is in mine, but can anybody think about what this species might be? And we'll kind of get it rolling in the chat box. So again, if you don't mind, comment in the chat box and see if we can identify this one. Anybody have any ideas? I'll give you this one. Okay, this one is actually marsh elder. So marsh elder is a annual in the sunflower family. And so we're going to see it predominantly in the eastern part of the US and eastern part of Texas, but it actually loves the Trinity River bottom. The clay content of those soils and just the dampness of that, the name pretty much implies that it's found in marshy or wet areas. But it can almost create a pure monoculture in some of those geographies if left unmanaged. All right, we'll keep going here. Whoops. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is that we have different types of weeds, and I want to make sure that everybody on the phone remembers or understands that we have annuals, perennials, and biennials. And for sure, control strategies are going to differ depending on what type of species you have. So that's the herbicide you use, that's the rate that you use, and that's when you use it. And in many cases, what type of adjuvant system you use with it will depend on what's actually out there. So being able to identify something is paramount. Now, there's a couple of different weeds on here, and we'll go through some of these, but these are representative of our annual weeds found in nature. And so we have stuff like woolly croton or doveweed or goatweed that has about 5 names to it. We have beautiful sunflowers. So most of our sunflowers are annuals with a few exceptions. We also have common broomweed, which is an annual. Now, as we get further out west, we do start to get into broom snakeweed, which is a congener to this plant, but is actually a perennial version. And then we have mare's tail up on the top right there. And though that one can be a biennial because sometimes it will come up in the fall of the previous year over winter and then come up and produce a seed head in the spring. So a little bit of difference there, but by and large, that's an annual. So some things to think about with these annual species. Number one, they only survive for one growing season in most cases. Number two, there are bunches and bunches of plant families that are represented within the annuals. And so there's a wide range of different growth habits and looks and flower sizes and everything. The key to success in annual plant control is to make sure that you hit them early. Once they start going to seed production or even flower production in most cases, control efforts are going to be truncated and won't result in a pure kill of that plant because the carbohydrate flow and all of the activity is going up into that flower and seed production. You won't actually typically get good control. So 4 to 6 inches is a magic number. You'll see that on a lot of labels, on a lot of herbicide labels, and the fact that it's actively growing is a key as well. When we start to think about some of our weed populations that flush late, we get into June and July, and those are going into drought. If the plants are drought stressed, they typically will not be affected by a lot of herbicides. Something to think about as well is that residual herbicides can really help in these cases. And I'm meaning something that contains aminopyrrolid or picloram, metsulfuron methyl, those that have some soil longevity. 2,4-D and dicamba and saflufenicil would be examples of herbicides that don't have much of any longevity in the soil. Those later flushes can be held back by something with a residual in it. I also want to talk about biennial weeds. So those are weeds that complete their life cycle in 2 years. Many times these may come up early in the fall the previous year and then complete their life cycle in the spring of the following year. But the thistles are one big example of this plant family or plant group. So many of our thistles are native even in this area, but some species like musk thistle and nodding thistle are actually a little bit invasive depending on the area. I will say that pollinators benefit from our native thistles, so it's important that you figure out exactly what your management objectives are. If those management objectives include consideration for pollinators, which I highly suggest, it might be beneficial to leave many of our thistles out there unless you do have one of those invasive thistles like musk thistle. That's the third picture over there. And also Scotch thistle is another one that can become really invasive. So let's switch gears and talk just a little bit about perennial weeds. So perennial weeds are those that can last multiple years in a lifespan. Many of our nightshades, horse nettles, silverleaf nightshade, even some of our ground cherries are perennials, and those will last for a long period of time. Some of our species of ragweed, western ragweed is pictured here, and that's the root system out of that. I was actually helping dig some fence posts the other day and pulled up this root system. And so that's intact, and you'll notice that there's multiple stems coming off that main horizontal root. Many of our perennial grasses are actually perennials in the stance that they either have a crown or they have rhizomes under the ground that they regrow from every year. With perennials, it's very, very important that we time this at the post-bloom or fall application timing. You can get burn down of all of these if you time it in the springtime or early summer when the plants start to come up. But the reality is, if you spray this early now, it will top kill it, but that root system will survive because the flow of carbohydrates, once again, is up to the top growth versus being down into the root system. And so it's important that we time those for that later season. So I can already hear the question, Chad, we don't understand because we have perennial weeds and we have annual weeds in our pastures. How do we time it for both? That's a really good question. And I think the main answer to that is that it really depends on what your overall objectives are. If you utilize a herbicide that does have good soil residual, there's a good chance that you will be able to hold back many of these perennials with a early season or mid-season application timing. But the reality is many of these will grow back. And so we really have to think about it in a long-term plan versus a short-term plan. Okay, let's go through some weeds. All right. I know we kind of talked about this one, but in the chat, does anybody remember what this one was called? I'll give you a couple of seconds to type because I know myself, I'm a slow typer. Box elder? No, that's not a bad guess, although this is a weed and not a tree. So box elder is a tree. But you have the suffix correct. This is marsh elder. Marsh elder. So it's going to be in the sunflower family, and it's going to be one that we see periodically in the wetter parts of our pastures. I have seen it even into Montague County and even further. So it can occur in wet areas. And like I said, along the Trinity River Basin, you could probably find it. What does everybody think this one is? Thistle, that's right. Very good. So I actually have about 4 or 5 shown here. A couple of these are our natives. So we have wavy leaf thistle and field thistle. But some of them, like the one in the bottom right, is a musk thistle, and that one is actually an invasive species. And it's actually one that TxDOT fights with on a regular basis. So that's a tough one to get rid of. It is a biennial, remember. And so we have to understand that the best time to treat those biennials is in that rosette stage. So before we get that bolt on it, look for those small, almost manure size rosettes, and they'll still have that same leaf look to them, but they'll all be growing right along the ground versus upright. And once they start to produce that upright stem, it gets tougher and tougher to control them. All right, I have several different here. Which ones are these? Ragweeds. That's right. Very good. So we have Western ragweed, that is a perennial, and we have giant ragweed, common ragweed, those are annuals. And then I'm going to actually show you one more that's also a annual. So this is Western ragweed versus marsh elder. And then on the bottom here, I've thrown in another one. It's actually a ragweed as well, but it's called lanceleaf ragweed, and it's found a lot in our wetter areas as well. Marsh elder and lanceleaf ragweed like to hang out sometimes, although lanceleaf ragweed actually has a further expansion on west, and so you may see it more common. One thing to note, and I like the fact that these are zoomed in pictures. I took a couple of these, but a couple of these I found on the internet as well. But look at all those hairs. Now, when we have plants that have a lot of hairs, I want to make sure that everybody understands that a lot of times it's going to be very difficult to get control of those with just a normal adjuvant system like a non-ionic surfactant. So many of our recommendations for herbicide use will say use an NIS. For these species that have a lot of hairs on them, to be able to penetrate through those hairs and get to the stem, it's important that we use something like a methylated seed oil, or in some cases, some of the blends like a dynamic or some of the other blends of NISs and MSOs can sometimes work pretty well. So the reality is that if we don't use something that can penetrate through those hairs, we'll spend a lot of money on herbicide and not get much control. Does anybody have a guess on this one? We've switched families here. Got some question marks. All right, so this one is in the spurge family. This is actually going to be toothed spurge. We have a couple that we're going to talk about here shortly, but the reason I bring this one up, and it is a type of poinsettia actually, because poinsettias are in the spurge family as well. One thing to think about is that those seed capsules are very, very high in fat content, and so many of our upland bird species, quail and otherwise, really love to utilize this plant as a food source. And so while cattle producers and hay producers may want to get rid of this one, species that are in the spurge family, like our next one as well, are very often utilized by wildlife. So it's just a matter of opinion whether this is a weed or not. What do we think about this one? Doveweed, very good. Doveweed, goatweed, croton, it has about 5 or 6 different names depending on where we're at. They're all the same species. This particular one is woolly croton or goatweed, Croton capitata. Now, as we move further west, we will actually get into some of our one seed crotons and some of our other Texas croton. We have some smaller species that will have a smaller leaf size and also have a little bit smaller flower and seed capsule as well. So while they're a little bit different, they're all in that croton genus. They're all very highly sensitive to 2,4-D containing products. And so that's one thing to consider as you're thinking about whether or not you need to control this species. Now, this is actually a picture I took just last week, and this is the size that croton is right now. Now, if you'll remember, these are an annual species, so what size, and you can put it in the chat, what size do we need to treat these species at as an annual? Four to 6 inches, very good. So we really want just a few inches tall. Now, these are obviously about 1.5 to maybe 2 inches tall. You can imagine what a 4-inch size plant looks like. And I'll tell you that that one on the top left is actually about a 10 to 12 inch tall plant. So in the grand scheme of label language, we've actually already exceeded what the recommended spray rate is for that species. Now, how many of you go out and dig deeply into your grass cover to see these little 4-inch weeds? Probably not many of us. And I will say that most folks don't even recognize that we have this species until it gets to about 10 to 12 inches tall. As long as it's still in the vegetative stage and kind of a single stem growth, like that one in the top left, we have seen very good successful applications on it. As we get into that branching stage and into the flowering stage, we start to see control wane off quite significantly. I will also say that anytime you mow a pasture that has croton in it or goat weed in it, the resulting flushes of croton that come back, and you are likely not going to kill croton with a shredder or a mower. You'll just cut it down back to size. And so that big root system and that small upward growth that comes back after mowing is going to be very difficult to kill as well. So I would highly recommend treating this species before you shred. What do we think about this one? This is a fun family of species right here. There you go. Silverleaf nightshade. That's very close. It is in the nightshade family. This one's actually Carolina horse nettle. We have western horse nettle further out west. Some have white flowers, some have purple flowers, and they all produce that berry-looking tomato. You'll notice that also tomatoes and ground cherries, tomatillos, are actually in the nightshade family as well as our potatoes. So a very robust family of plants that we utilize in an ornamental version. And eggplant is actually in the nightshade family as well. So this family is widely utilized by us in the cultivated systems, but this is a perennial plant, as is silverleaf nightshade, and many times they're going to perennialize very quickly. So it's important for us to get a handle on them. So in this particular set of photos, I have horse nettle on the left that we just looked at. And then I think one or two of you suggested that was silverleaf nightshade. This one's actually silverleaf nightshade on the right. So you'll notice kind of a grayish or silver look to the leaf versus the one on the left. You also notice that the one on the left has dentate type leaf margins or teeth versus the more intact and entire leaf of this one on silverleaf nightshade. The scientific name for silverleaf nightshade actually indicates that the leaves look like an olive leaf, and that is very true. Many of our olive plants have kind of that grayish silvery undertone to them, and so that's a pretty easy way to differentiate them. I will say all of our weedy nightshades are going to have quite a few thorns, so you'll know them when you reach down to grab them for sure. This is actually a picture taken last week at my place, where we do have weeds, unfortunately, much to the bereavement of my wife. We do actually have silverleaf nightshade and horse nettle coming up right now, but it's at a very small stage. That's only about a 3-inch size plant. Again, these are all perennials. Do we control this species at this stage? Yes, well, it will definitely top kill them at this stage. But the reality is that we need to control these very good in the fall or at least late summer time of the year. And the reason we do that is so that all of that herbicide will be taken down with the nutrients down into the root system versus all of the nutrients going up to create more top growth this time of year. So we can top kill these and just kind of suppress them this time of year, but to get full on out control, it's best to time them at or after flowering, kind of similar to what that stage is to the left over there. It's even okay to apply to these when they're in the fruiting stage, like the silverleaf nightshade is there with the tomatoes, as long as the leaves are still actively growing and accepting in that herbicide. Once we get into drought stress or we start to see some frost damage, definitely too late to try to get control on those. All right, what do we think about this one? Any ideas? I know we switched gears a little bit and we're not talking about a broadleaf plant here. Johnson grass, that's exactly right. Very good job, everybody. So Johnson grass is definitely an invasive species. It is not from here. It's actually from Asia, and it is a non-native invasive. We fight with it in pastures. We fight with it on the roadsides. We even fight with it in yards, depending on where you live. So it's a really tough one. I will say that it comes back from perennial root rhizomes. That's the part of the plant that's right there growing. And so it is a tough one to get control of. I apologize, I said it was from Asia. It's actually from Europe. But we do actually see those rhizomes break up very, very easily. And in fact, I was out taking some soil cores for a soil test the other day and popped open one of the soil cores, and there lay a little joint that is a part of that root rhizome. So every time you either plow up a field or you disc up a field for aeration or other uses, if you do have Johnson grass, there's a high probability that you're going to be chopping up those roots and spreading that Johnson grass. So it's important that you have a control plan ready. There are a couple of different options depending on if you're in a improved pasture like Bermuda grass or Bahia grass or KR blue stem. You can use glyphosate, and just a light rate of glyphosate will kill Johnson grass, but it will not permanently kill the grass that you're trying to raise. If you do have native grass, or if you don't want to have that potential to have some grass injury, there's another product called Outrider out there, and that's what the DOTs use on a regular basis. It is selective just to Johnson grass and several other grasses, and so it's going to be way more selective than the Roundup option. You have to remember that Roundup is completely non-selective, so anything green, it will likely kill, or at least knock back for sure. Okay, let's switch gears to woody plants. Does anybody have a guess of what this one is? Your pear tree. Understandably so. So this is Callery pear or Bradford pear. Again, it is also non-native. It is in our rose family. That's a pretty robust family of woody plants that we use both for ornamentals and also have a lot of that are represented in nature. It's a medium to, half-size tree. The reason we brought those over here is that many of our native pears were suffering from fire blight. Come to find out, when we cross-pollinate and get Bradford pears that have crossed with other pear species, and they can do that, they are susceptible to fire blight as well. So unfortunately, that didn't work out for us. They were supposed to be brought in and be completely sterile, but the reality is that they will have small little pear-sized fruits, and those are viable seeds, unfortunately, and the birds just absolutely love them, and so they can spread them a lot. They are starting to really increase across the southern and eastern U.S. While that map kind of indicates a cutoff from Oklahoma to Arkansas, the reality is this is all the way up into Minnesota now. And we really start to see this impact native ecosystems. We don't have as much of a problem with it in the Fort Worth, Tarrant County, Parker County area, But as we move further east up into the Red River parts of the state, we do start to see an increase in Callery pear or Bradford pear. That picture was taken in Stillwater down on the lower left. You can see that the eastern red cedar is being invaded by Callery pear. And so we have the worst of both worlds there. Okay, so when we think about control recommendations, broadcast treatments just really don't work real well on this species. It is one of those that is best controlled with a basal application or a cut surface application of Remedy Ultra and Basal Oil. There are some other product names for Remedy Ultra now that are out there. You can also use Basal Oil or Diesel. Diesel is typically easier to find, but Basal Oil is definitely a little bit softer on the environment. So one of two ways. One of the things that I would talk about and think about is that if there's any way you can actually promote the use of alternative species in your neighborhoods, in your HOAs, as an urban planner, any of our native species like Eastern Redbud, Texas Redbud, American Plum, Mexican Plum, Carolina Buckthorn, all have that same type of growth habit and shade for the environment. But they are not going to be invasive. And so that might be something that you can promote in your channels as much as possible to try to curb the use of Callery pear that's still out there even today. Even new neighborhoods that are going in, I see lots and lots of Callery pear out there. Okay, what do we have for this one? My folks over here in Grayson County may have a little bit tougher time with this one if they're especially on the eastern side of the county. Honey mesquite, that's right. Fantastic. Good job, everybody. This one is actually native. It is a Sonoran species and even Chihuahuan species. We have several different mesquite species across the U.S. Honey mesquite is the most prominent one we have here in this part of the world. And I will say that a lot of folks have a love and hate relationship with mesquite. Of course, since it is native, it's very well adapted to the area. And many of our farmers from back in the early stages of settlement actually survive sometimes on mesquite beans for their cattle. And so many of those cattle spread across the state, and that's how mesquite got such a wide expansion. And it definitely can get very, very upset if you cut it down or mulch it. That's why I don't recommend doing that at all, because you can go from a single stem tree, to a small bush, and those get very difficult to control even with a herbicide. So there's a couple of different herbicide options out there. And what I will say about these, Sendero in particular, is very, very selective to plants in the legume family. So you'll kill honey mesquite, you'll kill some of the acacias, you'll kill some of the honey locusts, but many of our native hardwoods are very tolerant to Sendero. Invora has a little bit more activity on some of those other brush species, but by and large, compared to something like a Remedy or a Pasture Guard, it is relatively selective as well. So something to think about for utilization. Timing is for sure key for these types of applications broadcast wise. There's a finite window that we can control honey mesquite in that area, 40 to 90 days after bud break. And at least in Grayson County, in the western part of the county, we have quite a bit of mesquite, and that occurred the last week in March here in Grayson County, probably sometime in late March, early April in most of the state, here in the northern part of the state. When we do applications, whether those are by ground or by air, volume of total spray volume is very, very important to get good coverage. And so
Chad,
those are the, yes,
we
sorry.
got a question in this chat box before you go any further of how does this affect honeybees?
Absolutely. So I guess let me ask or specify exactly, how does the herbicide affect honeybees, or how does honey locust or honey mesquite affect honeybees? I'm guessing the herbicide, but herbicide. Okay. So the reality is that all of these herbicides have a very low toxicity to honeybees themselves. If you spray the honeybees or spray around the honeybees, in most cases, we try to spray when native bees and honeybees are actually dormant in their boxes. So early in the morning prior to them coming out, we can minimize the amount of impact that we're going to have on those bee populations. You can find the actual SDS information of toxicity to apiary. So that is out there. As far as affecting the plants that the honeybees utilize for a nectar source, you have to realize that many of these will still have some impact on the existing broadleaf plants that are out there. So a widely broadcast application may actually decrease the amount of pollinating plants in that local area, but also realize that bees can travel miles to find nectar plants. So it's not necessarily going to impact them long term. And many of our natives and introduced broadleaf plants that produce nectar flowers can come back relatively quickly after an application like this. What about the effects on the honey? I would have to yield to an expert on that one. I don't know that there would be a huge number of different ones, but I guess if you have beehives, I would actually go for this last statement, and that's an individual plant foliar treatment or a cut surface individual plant treatment that would vastly minimize the amount of impact you're going to have on the bees, the honey, the pollinator plants that are going to be around the mesquite. That would be my suggestion to utilize. Now, if you're talking about 500 acres, that becomes a little bit cost ineffective. But if you have a small acreage property where you just need to get rid of some of those honey mesquites, I would highly recommend the individual plant treatment option. Okay, what do we have for this tree or group of trees? Junipers and cedars. Very good job. So this is a wide range of different species that are actually native to our area. We have eastern red cedar over in our part of the world, a little bit of ash juniper, but not much. And then as we move further into the western North Texas geography, we move into mountain juniper, one-seeded juniper, alligator juniper, ash juniper. You guys have more junipers than you know what to do with out there. So we have red berry junipers and blueberry junipers and just all kinds of fun. So this one's actually in the cypress family. I don't know if everybody knew that, but it's actually very closely related to bald cypress that we have in the ponds and in the bayous. Very similar growth habit as well. These are usually evergreen subshrubs, and so they're going to be constantly taking water out of the system. Something to think about as we manage those or decide whether to or to not manage them. They also create a very barren microclimate right underneath them, and that's partly because of the shade that's produced from those dense canopies, but also because of the acidity that results from the dropping of the leaf-like needles. Or needle-like leaves that come off of the trees. So many of you who have ever cut down junipers know that when you get underneath them, there's not hardly anything growing, maybe a few sedges or a small little broadleaf or something, but by and large, it creates a very monoculture environment underneath the tree itself. These trees actually represent a huge part of that expansion of woody plant encroachment across the central Great Plains, down even into Texas. And so what we need to understand is that it's a big problem. If we have the ability to get rid of them, I would highly recommend it. And whether you mulch it or burn it, that's all viable treatments. But anything herbicide wise, I would be very hard pressed to say that you're going to get much more than suppression on this species. It's just very resilient to most of our herbicides. In the Brush Busters recommendations and in the ERM 1466, we do have a couple of herbicides that are listed as control. That's picloram containing herbicides like Tordon or Surmount. And then we also have hexazinone containing herbicides like Velpar. Those two herbicide classes are pretty effective, but other than that, we don't have a lot of good herbicide options. And prescribed fire is one of the best tools to utilize for these species. Now, I will say that a lot of these species do not resprout. So once you kill the top portion, you are done with that. There are a few out in the western part of the state, redberry juniper being one of them, that do resprout quite prolifically. So you just need to do a long-term type consideration on those. So let's talk just a little bit more about prescribed fire. So can prescribed fire be used to kill all the woody plants? And I would say that the unfortunate answer is likely no, in the reality that we are really just trying to get control or a change in the environment. What we see happen quite often is that we have a wide range of different plants that have differing susceptibility to fire. You'll notice that a fire just went through this area not too long ago, and then what we have coming there on the right-hand side is one of our oak species that's just starting to pop back up from the basal crown. So before we get started in which ones are susceptible, which ones are tolerant, I want to make sure everybody has the same definition of those two terms. So with susceptible species, the fire will usually result in a top kill, and then the tree or shrub lacks the ability to regrow from a crown or a lateral root. And some of our junipers are the best examples of this, where they have no real lateral root development. And so once we kill that tree from the ground up, we're pretty much done with that. A tolerant species would be one that has minimal long-term effect. We may get some top kill. We may get some reduction in the overall canopy of those species, but they will come back either from the resilience that they have on the stems themselves, like a mature pine tree, where we can actually utilize fire in and amongst the pines, or we actually see them come back from a bunch of axial and lateral roots that will really get going right after that occurs. One of the species that's most commonly associated with this would be honey mesquite or honey locust, where if we kill the top plant, similar to what was stated in the chat box there earlier, you come back with just a mad little plant of grandchildren that are ready to come up and become major problems. So when we think about what we want to do on the landscape and what we want to control, remember that the visible portion in many cases is the part where the control measure is applied, whether that's a herbicide, whether that's a fire, whether that's a mulching or grubbing job. The root system, though, the lateral roots in particular, or the crown root in regard to the mesquite tree, those are the parts that we really need to focus on trying to kill. And so the ability of our herbicide timing or our grubbing or our whatever event that we're going to do is timed such that it can get down to the root system. That's what we need to try to do. So which plants are susceptible to fire? There is a very, very short list of most of the plants that are located in both of our geographies. So eastern red cedar, and I'm just going to loop in most of our junipers that do not resprout. So with the exception of redberry juniper and ash juniper, most of these are going to be very susceptible to fire. American elm, cottonwood, hackberry, and young, less than 2 years old, pine trees. Those are all going to be killed or severely injured by fire. Now, you'll notice I also have a little bit of caveats in some of those, the astracees there. Unfortunately, some of those trees, if they get older and get well established and get a hard bark layer on them, you can actually run a low intensity fire through those and actually not kill them and utilize the fire to kill stuff underneath them or to thin out some of the brush underneath them, and utilize fire as a tool in that management ecosystem. The list of trees that is not controlled by fire is much, much longer. And while we're on the computer screen, it's a little bit easier for you guys to see all of this. When I bring this up in a room full of people, it's a little bit tough for them to even differentiate out what species are in there. But many of those are found across our geographies. I will say honey mesquite and cedar elm and greenbrier and some of the persimmons are some of the ones that are most common across the geography. Then over further east, we have a lot of the sweet gum, bodark, dogwood, and persimmon that persist a lot through different either herbicide or fire type treatments. So unfortunately, we have a lot of respriders here in the hardwood forests, and that's a very difficult one to fight with fire. You can over time burn out species, but the fire return interval has to be so great and so small, I should say, less than 1 year in some cases, to be able to deplete that root system of nutrients enough that you get outright kill. That many times fire is utilized in these systems just to sculpt the landscape versus actually outright control it. So what does fire look like? And you know as well as I do that prescribed fire is completely different than a wildfire, right? We do prescribe fires under a set group of metrics of weather and of climate, where we have fine-tuned this to utilize it in a safe and productive manner. So while wildfires still do regrow, a lot of times it takes them a little bit longer to regrow than what a prescribed fire does, because they may be a little bit more intense and may cause a little bit more damage to the crust layer of the soil, may deplete the grass reserves. Many times we see wildfires occur when we do have severe drought systems. And so we see that long-term damage. But in many cases, in prescribed fire usage, you can have grass start to regrow within weeks of the fire event itself. And by 1 year after, you have a wonderful, beautiful pollinator forest of forbs and wildflowers and some of our resprouting brush that comes back. But it really benefits the system. And so you get that instant utilization by your grazing livestock, but you get that longer term utilization by many of your pollinators. When we see 2 to 3 years after fire in many of our mixed grass or tall grass prairie regions, like we have in Tarrant County to the Grayson County line, we really see that tall grass and mid grass start to take back over 2 to 3 years after that burn event. And so any areas that are burned on a regular cycle will start to really select for that diverse group of ecosystems. And we actually have a system called patch burning, where we can burn just portions of that pasture and actually get utilization and those different heterogeneous landscapes across the area, and not just have it all look either recently burned or have it all look many years from burn. So it's very beneficial to try to use small portions of that whenever possible. The reality and the myth of restoration are two different things, unfortunately, and this graph presented by the Prairie Project is a good representation of that. Whether we're talking about a catastrophic or prescribed fire event, or a mulching event or a grubbing event that occurs, the thought process is that I can do that one time, and it's going to change that site from a woodland all the way back to an intact prairie. The reality of the situation, unfortunately, is that if we do just one restoration event, the reality is that we're going to likely see a resurgence of some of those woody plants, whether that be juniper trees, whether that be some of our hardwoods that resprout. That will occur because there's still going to be plenty of recruitment and encroachment in those areas. And so without a follow-up treatment of some kind, there's a good chance that within just 5 to 10 years, we're going to be right back in that heavily wooded area again. Now I'm going to go just briefly over native grasses, and many of you may know these pretty well. Just wanted to touch base on them, just a couple of different things. Within the tallgrass prairie, so Tarrant County is kind of on the edge of the tallgrass prairie, if not in the mixed grass prairie, which some of these are still represented there. And then Grayson County is the blackland prairie predominantly. Historically, we would have been tallgrass prairie with an oak overstory. And so really what we see is a predominance of these four grasses. Big blue stem, or turkey foot, some folks call it. Very productive grass. It's very good for both livestock and wildlife. Little blue stem is one other prairie dominant, and it's going to be a very major one in the mixed grass prairie as well. So we will get to see that as one of our species. And then just to remind everybody, these plants actually evolved with fire in the system. And so to get the most production out of them, many times we get higher production when we do burn these. I will say that you can clip it and simulate grazing or simulate a fire event, whether that's a hay event or a grazing event. But the reality is that to return a lot of that biomass back to the ground, it's important that we burn those on a semi-regular basis. Will we talk about greenbrier in this section? And I will discuss it just briefly here in a moment. So when we think about Indian grass, this is one of our other big tall grasses. This is a great one for wildlife. It's fairly good for livestock forage. I will say that in fairly heavily utilized pastures, you won't actually find a whole lot of Indian grass because it is one of our ice cream plants. It'll be eaten first before they get to the other stuff. And then finally, to top it off, we have switchgrass, and that's one that is actually utilized in some systems as a monoculture. You can buy seed and plant this as a monoculture. Very high quality for cattle. I will say it needs to be managed fairly intensely, and then many of the animals can benefit from it for sure. So let's talk just a little bit about kind of the situation that we're in. And we have come out of it here in Grayson County, but we were in it for all of last summer, all of last growing season. I know that in Tarrant County, you guys are now still abnormally dry, but the long-term effects from that persistent drought are definitely there. One thing to think about is that if we have a short amount of top growth, we are going to have a short amount of root growth. And that root growth is pivotal in our perennial grasses for survival and longevity. And so to be able to get a good amount of root growth and resilience to drought, resilience to other nutrient deficiencies, we have to be able to have that root development. And so we need to give each pasture recovery. It's very, very important. So how you do that may look different in all the different situations, but the reality is plants need rest. The other thing that I see happen on a regular basis is that folks will overestimate how much grazable forage they have. So I'm going to show you just a brief example. We have a 160-acre pasture here. We have obviously some woodland there. But if a producer bases their stocking rate off of a 160-acre pasture, in this particular example, they would be heavily, heavily overstocked. If we use our rangeland analysis platform tool that I showed you earlier, we can actually see that this particular tract of land is 40% cover in trees. And so what we know about the tree cover in this geography is that underneath that tree cover, you will have some grass production in some parts of the year, but it predominantly is going to be cool season grass produced from November to about May. And so from May to the next November, you're going to have very minimal grass production. Cattle will utilize that as shade, but they won't be able to utilize it as a forage source. And so if you stock that property for 160 acres, say 10 acres per animal, so we've got 16 animals on it, that's going to be about 2x the amount of animals that you should have on there, which will result in a overutilization standpoint. And then we won't have any root growth and any sustainability for that system. So it's Very, very important that we accurately estimate how much usable forage we have. When we think about what can we do, where can we start, what areas do we need to spend our time on? And I know with a lot of my small landowners, we think about this on a regular basis. I've got 5 pastures. Which one should I spend the time on? When it comes to woody plant encroachment or woody plant invasion, it's best to try to start with those intact prairies and try to maintain those as long as possible. That's where it all starts. That's where the initial invasion will occur. And that's where we can start to see the biggest impact from those 2 or 3 seedlings of either juniper or honey mesquite or honey locust, sweet gum as we get further east in the geography. What we need to make sure is that we have the ability to keep those intact prairies intact. Now, it's definitely important that we start to get some of that encroachment taken care of, that we minimize that seed dispersal and recruitment area there. But the important part is to maintain that intact prairie. So as we look at it as a whole, it really is important for us to think about it in a holistic viewpoint. And I realize that to qualify for holistic management, you have to have so many set of ground rules, but every one of us can be a holistic manager if we do it correctly. I used in my wildlife dimension or human dimensions of wildlife management class this adaptive management cycle, and I really like it because what we can see there is the ability to have a planning phase, we have an implementation phase, we have an evaluation phase. And when we evaluate that, we try to make sure that we are still aligned to our goals and our objectives that we set forth. And we may have to modify some of those goals and objectives. So it's important that we have the ability to adapt and to adjust when we have that new set of criteria that we need to reassess. So a couple of different things we can do. And definitely Jacqueline and I can help you with this. That planning phase is probably one of the most important parts. And either as a new landowner or as an existing landowner that may want to change your trajectory a little bit, the best version of your property is identifiable. And we can help you identify that, whether it's myself, Jacqueline, the NRCS agents in our prospective counties. The central appraisal districts are also very good at trying to help you evaluate what may work best for your operation and also how to best utilize special valuations and exemptions within your property. On improved pastures in particular, make sure you get a soil test. Just throwing fertilizer out there can be a complete waste of money if you're throwing stuff out there that's unnecessary, or over fertilizing land can also have a detrimental effect as well. Also, proper timing of that fertilization can definitely benefit your system. When we think about all of the tools that we have in our toolbox, that weed and brush control part is very, very important. We just learned that the timing of many of those actions is important as well, and how we utilize all those tools in the toolbox to create that integrated program is very important. And then, of course, when we get to that evaluation phase and we see that the plan is either going toward our end objective, or if we need to adjust that plan, adjust that stocking rate, adjust that tool that we utilized a little bit to get us to that objective, it's important that we reassess that. And as we start to get further into the summer, I know we're just coming out of a major drought in both of our geographies. It's important for us to make sure that our adjustment of stocking rates is correct. We need to make sure that we have the right number of animals on the ground for this situation. Just because Grandpa had 35 head on the ground doesn't necessarily mean that now that we have 40% tree cover, we can still have 40 head on the ground. It's important that we make sure we have the right stocking rate for season-long and or rotational grazing. And if we need to cull those older or non-productive animals, this is the time to do it. And make sure you give that land some rest. The rest is hugely important for root growth, hugely important for carbon sequestration, hugely important for biodiversity, and the ability of that land to produce all those different species, whether we're talking about the soil microbes, all the way up to the pollinators, all the way up to those apex and keystone species like quail and cattle and white-tailed deer. So it's very, very important that we get those animals on the ground at the right density. So before I put it all together and kind of conclude, I do want to touch on greenbrier. So greenbrier is one species where after the 20 years that I've been a range manager and the 14 years that I worked for Corteva Agriscience, the 10 years that I know James Jackson, who was out of the Stephenville office, worked on trying to come up with a really good product concept and treatment regime for greenbrier. We still don't have one. And I know that's unfortunate. I apologize for that. But the reality is we don't have a really good broadcast or IPT recommendation for greenbrier. Greenbrier is one of those plants that has an extensive root system, and I'll send a picture to Jacqueline to hand out to the group. But I have a buddy of mine in Mississippi that sent on a picture of a Polaris Ranger, and the back end's filled with greenbrier roots, and it looks like sweet potatoes on steroids. I mean, they're just huge. So if you think about controlling that huge potato of a root system with a small amount of leaf up there in the greenbrier stem, it's almost impossible. And so repeat applications of some of our tougher herbicides like a Remedy Ultra or a Pasture Guard are going to be the best treatment for those. Individual plant treatments are going to be the best. And that's especially if you have clumps of it growing in the pasture. If you have it in the understory of the forest or a wooded area, it's going to be difficult because many of those leaves are actually going to come out up in the canopy. So you may have very limited leaf tissue there to treat. One of our worst species out there, and in fact, one of the kind of tongue-in-cheek answers I usually give is the best herbicide for a greenbrier invaded area is to get a good real estate agent, because you're just probably never going to get rid of it. It's unfortunate, but it's a reality. And then one other question there, it looks like, how about khaki weed and sandbur? Sandbur is one that is a problem throughout both of our geographies. Khaki weed is a little bit more a problem in Jacqueline's area, but I will say that sandbur, we have a couple of different options. One is a pre-emergent application in January, February of a product like Resilon. Prowl works decent for that particular weed if timed correctly. But the unfortunate reality is that we have a lot of early emergence of sandbur in the geography. And so if you don't get out there really early, you're going to miss it. And going into a kind of 1-2 punch of treating with something like Resilon in the fall, in that September timeframe, and then treating again in the springtime or wintertime in January, February may be the best one. And then for khaki weed, I'd have to look that one up. I apologize. I'm not exactly sure what the best treatment for it's going to be. So before I wrap up, do we have any other quick questions? All right. Well, just as kind of an overview, I do want to make sure that everybody knows that invasive species are real. And whether we're talking about true invasives or those encroaching species, many of our natural ecosystems are at threat. And anything that we can do to help minimize those is going to be very important. Prescribed fire is one of many tools that can be utilized for invasive species management. Many of those are pretty fine-tuned as far as how we utilize it. I will also say that there are plenty of prescribed burn associations around, definitely around Jacqueline's area, but a few up east of us in Grayson County as well. Lean on those and try to get some help. definitely don't try to do prescribed fire on your own. Really only a few tree species are susceptible to fire ultimately, and we can definitely use fire to sculpt the land, but we can't necessarily use it to control a lot of our species. Eastern red cedar would be one, or most of the junipers are one big exception to that. And I really highly recommend using fire for the treatment of that particular species. And then making sure that we know what herbicide we're getting and what the best tools are for that objective is very, very important. Read those herbicide labels, because not all weeds are on all herbicide labels. And we really want to know what we're going after and what should be used to treat it. And then also, I always say, or I always joke, that herbicides are kind of a catalyst to make that quick desired change in natural communities, but a heavy reliance on it as the one and only management tool is going to result in an unachievable objective. And so it's important for us to look at that broader version of what our land could be and what those landscapes as a whole could be to help us get to that end result. And when we put all those together, the cultural, the mechanical, the fire, the chemical, when we put all of those together in a holistic long-term approach, that's when we see the most success. And I highly encourage that all of us think about that. That, I believe, is everything I have. And Jacqueline, if we don't have any questions, or maybe we can open up the phone line to actual audible questions too, if you want to.
Sure. If anybody has a question, please feel free to unmute at this time and ask your question. Also, in the chat box, I have placed the link for the program survey. Please take a moment and fill that out for us. As I mentioned at the beginning of the program, part of our Chad and I's objectives in terms of reporting back not only to our counties and our direct supervisors, but also to the state, is information that comes out of those surveys. So we would greatly appreciate it if you take your time to help us with that. But at this time, if there are any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. Or place it in the snap or in the chat box.
Yes, and there was a question that came up about, can I share the presentation PowerPoint slides? You bet. Actually, Jacqueline has the PDF form of these, and I would be more than happy to let her pass that along to all the attendees for sure, or put it up on your Facebook page too, or website. So
after I get a little bit of editing done on this presentation, it will be going up on our YouTube page. I will be sending that link out to everyone, and then I will be sure to send out the PDF with the slide deck at that time as well. Well, Chad, it looks like you covered everything so thoroughly that we've answered everybody's questions, which is always a great feeling for a Friday afternoon.
There you go. Yeah. Or everybody's already started on the Cinco de Mayo celebrations, one of the two.
That too.
Yeah.
I forgot it was Cinco de Mayo.
You bet. All right. Well, thank you very much for everybody listening. Appreciate it a bunch.
So thank you for being with us, Chad. I even learned a lot with all of this today. So with that being said, thank you to everybody that is attended today. I will make sure I will get those links and everything sent out to you this next week. With that being said, happy Cinco de Mayo. Everybody enjoy your weekend.
See you later.
Bye.